Millie was engaged to Al when she met Ted at a dance in college, just before the war began for America. When she saw Ted and danced with him, one dance, she knew this was the man for her. Al would get an apology. Then came Pearl Harbor and the declaration of war. Ted enlisted. He was gone for 2.5 years. Millie never knowing from one day to the next if he was alive or dead. They married when he came home on leave in 1943. Their wedding picture, in black and white, is the photograph of an entire generation. Ted, young, thin, proud and handsome in his Marine uniform. Millie, young, vibrant, also proud and shining, her long dark hair curled, wearing her best suit for the occasion. There was no time to stage a big wedding. Their marriage was more like a formal elopement, a few moments stolen away from a world gone mad. Love is never so romantic as during and just after a war. They were together for 2 months before Ted shipped back to the Pacific. Their parting was just like a scene from a movie. Hollywood moguls didn't have to exaggerate their emotions. The war did it for them. Ted boarded a train, leaned out an open window, the train started, they kissed, their hands parted, they both shouted, "I love you," with all their hearts and souls. Ted waved farewell as Millie raced along, waving back, calling his name, and only giving way to tears after Ted was too far away to see them fall. Millie would not see her husband again for nearly 2 years. Ted returned when the war ended in 1945. When Millie saw him get off the train, as if he'd been on one long rail trip, her heart, filled with 4 years of hopes and fears, nearly burst for the love of him. They rushed together and held each other without speaking, and this time Millie cried without the slightest restraint. These were tears of joy, the evidence of that sadness that war stirs into the passion of love. They found a place to live, a small upstairs apartment in a house occupied by 2 elderly sisters. They deemed their quarters cozy, and Ted secured a job with the help of his college degree, his military background, and a connection through the Masons. Millie taught school. They were living not far from Ted's sister, Ruth. Ruth's husband, Bill, had been excused from service in the war because of a medical disability. He'd had infantile paralysis and one of his legs was 2 inches shorter than the other. He had worked as a supervisor in a munitions factory for 4 years and was well paid. He and Ruth had saved their money and had bought a house. On Sunday evenings, they would invite Ted and Millie to join them for dinner at their home, along with Ted's mom and dad. One night when they were driving back to their apartment, Ted told Millie that soon they would have a house too. Millie, who was sitting next to Ted on the front seat with her arm around him, kissed him on the cheek and told him it didn't matter, that as long as she was with him, she'd be happy anywhere on earth. "Hey, watch it," Ted said. "You're going to cause an accident." "I don't care," said Millie, and she flurried his cheek with kisses. The days passed and the year came to an end. That first year when they were together, that wonderful time when every day seemed like a honeymoon, when Ted would come home from work in his suit and tie, and Millie would be there at the door to greet him and ask how his day had been, and he could smell supper warming in the kitchen. Millie wasn't much of a cook, and the kitchen was small and not very well equipped, but that smell when he came home was one of the best things about Ted's day. Christmas was approaching. It would be their first Christmas together as man and wife, and Ted wanted to get Millie something wonderful. But he and Millie were saving every penny toward their new home. They really did have a glass jar in the kitchen, filled with change, pennies, nickels, dimes, quarters, and $half, and whenever it was full, Millie would empty it and roll the change, mostly pennies, into holders, take it to the bank, and add it to their nest fund. Another problem was that Ted wasn't really sure what Millie would like. He hadn't had much experience shopping for a woman. He'd spent 4 years in close quarters with men only. He didn't know anything about a woman's size or taste. Perfume, jewelry, Ted was a practical man. To him, the best uses for ladies' nylon hosiery were for storing tulip bulbs in the winter, and straining the lumps out of old paint. He was talking to Bill about a present one night when they were out bowling, and Bill laughed and said, "She wants a robe." Ted said, "How do you know?" And Bill said that Ruth had told him. Millie and Ruth had been talking about what they'd like to get for Christmas, and they both wanted robes, Bill said. "That's what I'm getting Ruth, a robe," he said. "Get her a robe." That settled it. If that's what Millie really wanted, then that's what Ted would get her. And more than that, he would get her the finest robe in the city. He got permission to take an extended lunch from work, drove downtown, and went to a store which he knew was known for its exclusive fashion, meaning it was the most expensive clothing shop in town. Ted had never been there before. A clerk came up to him and asked if he could be of service, and Ted said, "Yes, you can. I want the best robe you've got in this store, the top of the line." The clerk offered to show him a selection, and Ted said, "No, you don't have to show me anything. Just pick out the best robe you've got and wrap it up for me. You've got a return policy, don't you, if I want to bring it back?" The clerk assured him they did. Ted could return the robe in exchange for merchandise or cash. "Terrific," Ted said. "This is the finest material you've got?" The clerk assured him it was. "All right," said Ted. "I don't mind paying more for something if I know it's going to last." Oh, it was expensive, all right. Ted couldn't believe that anyone would charge that much for a robe, but it was for Millie, and he was determined to get her the best robe money could buy. And if she didn't like it, she could bring it back and exchange it for something else. On Christmas Day, Millie and Ted gave each other presents they'd put under their little tree, just the token gifts they'd promised each other, because the real present was the money they were saving for their house, that and the love they shared. In the afternoon, they drove over to Ruth's house to exchange gifts there and eat a hearty Christmas dinner. It was snowing lightly. Bing Crosby was singing White Christmas on the radio. Everything seemed to be a grand conspiracy to make this Christmas the best one ever. That spirit continued at Bill and Ruth's. When all the boxes had been opened, there were still 2 presents, large ones, under the tree. Bill knelt down and took one of them and handed it to Ruth. "Merry Christmas, honey," he said.